Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, these are the Welcome to Geektown interviews. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. We're continuing on with my discussion with Darick Robertson in the second of 3 parts. In this episode, we've reached the early 90s, when Darick became the regular artist on The New Warriors. This is where I first discovered his work and fell in love with his art style. And then we move on from there to the next few projects he worked on. Now, before we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about a sensitive subject. In episode 51 of the previous iteration of the show, I said that I would not be mentioning certain creators' names anymore, due to the reprehensible behavior that they have been accused of, unless and until they take the steps to rehabilitate themselves in a way that satisfies the victims of said abuse. Although I didn't name any specific people in that episode, one that I was referring to was Warren Ellis. You'll hear his name a number of times in this episode because his work with Darick Robertson was an important part of Darick's career, and it would feel disingenuous to ignore it. As far as I've read, Warren still has not taken the steps to make things right with his accusers. Please visit SoManyOfUs.com, which I will link to in the show notes, to read their stories and their goals. I asked Darick a question about how the revelations affected his feelings about the project, and while he gave a heartfelt answer, he later reached out and asked that it be cut, as he would rather not talk about the subject publicly. I wanted to be sure to address the topic while still being cognizant and respectful of Darick's wishes, and this is my best attempt to walk that line. My apologies to anyone who feels I overstepped in either direction. Please let me know your feelings on the subject, and I will do my best to improve as I continue. With that unpleasantness out of the way, let's get into part 2 of this interview and one of my favorite topics of all times, Speedball and the New Warriors. Well, let me get into a project that I'm a massive fan of, which is New Warriors.
Oh, great. Yeah.
First, were you at all familiar with the team before you got the gig?
Not at all. In fact, I almost lost the job because they gave me some sample pages. Danny Fingeroth, bless his heart. I had just done a Wonder Man annual, and Fabian was the editor at the time that he was writing New Warriors, and Mark Bagley was gonna go on to Spider-Man, so they were looking for a replacement for him. And Danny Fingeroth was the editor, and Danny was great. But he said, well, why don't you just draw a couple of pages of Spider-Man fighting the New Warriors? And I was like, okay, but I didn't have a script. I really didn't know the characters very well at all. And I didn't know like what they should be doing. So I just kind of focused on Spider-Man and what he would do to them. I didn't give them much personality. And they're not very good pages. And I still have like scans of them. But I gave them, and they said, well, we didn't really like your sample pages, but your Wonder Man annual looks so good. We're going to trust that you can handle it. And I was like, well, thanks for the leap of faith. They assigned me the book, and I became the original art or the regular artist on it. So, but I actually fell in love with those characters pretty quickly. I love the way Fabian wrote them, and I still love Speedball. Like I would do a Speedball series in a hot minute.
Your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, it'll never happen.
Yeah.
I think what I learned from that era, problem with big companies is that they're fickle. Their own bottom lines are what really drives decisions. And that's fair. They're a business. But I think that's what happened on Wolverine is what drove me back to create our own work.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
And that's why we have The Boys.
There we go. And I definitely have questions on those, but let me focus on
feel
New
free to ask.
Warriors.
Yeah, feel free to ask me about New Warriors.
So I remember opening New Warriors 26 and seeing that splash page of Vance with his face all swelled up and
Yeah,
his cheeks, bruises everywhere. And I was like, this is completely different. Because
yeah. I don't
Mark
think people were
Bagley's
ready
art,
for that.
Mark Bagley's art, at least to my eyes, is so like angular, and
Yeah.
there were so many curves, and it was he had this like round face. Were you specifically trying to differentiate yourself, or
No, I've never had any. I mean, that's like saying, am I manipulating my talking voice to be like this? No, this is just how I talk. That's just how I draw. I don't know how to. I mean, I've always absorbed the people that have influenced me over the years, but if you ask me to draw like them, I couldn't do it. Like the closest I've got is I've tried to be Brian Bolland, and I'm just, and my work is just the sad failure of trying to match his genius. I'm literally looking at a original cover to Action Comics 571 that I hang over my computer, and the line work. And this is an original that I have
Mhm.
of Bolland's, and the line work on that is so delicate and precise and perfect. I mean, you can't see, I don't see any mistakes. And I just don't know how a human hand can make work that perfect. And it didn't even print as well as as the original shows because of the limitations of the 80s. But it still baffles me that anybody could be that good. And so I study it and I want to be that good, but my hand doesn't do what his hand does. But there's the old saying goes, shoot for the moon. If you'll end up among the stars, you're doing okay.
Yeah. Well, and also you can get a regular monthly book out every month, whereas Boland was pretty much covers and one
Yeah.
shots, and
Well, he also he comes from a wealthy family, so he never had to really do it for the money. He just did it for the love of
okay,
it. That
yeah,
was from what I understood. It's like that's why also he kind of went off digitally before anybody else did because he could afford all that equipment.
computer equipment,
Apparently,
yeah,
that's just what
makes
I've heard.
sense.
He called me on my 40th birthday, and that was a lovely thing to do. So that's the
Oh,
only
nice.
interaction I've kind of had with him. But he's my favorite artist, and I always let the world know. But so as far as what you were saying, like, so did I do that? I was working with Larry Malstead, who also inked Bagley. Larry
Mm-hmm.
was really good, and I just did the best book I could do. I mean, that's all. Any comic that I got assigned in those days, like I just did it the best that I could make it in from what I like. But I'm a fan, so I try to draw. When I draw a comic, I try to draw a comic I'd want to read, and I think about like what you're seeing on the last page before you turn the page. All that stuff matters to me as a comic book fan. So I don't ever expect people to just pick up a comic book that I did because it's me. I want them to pick it up because they like what they're reading, and I want to draw them into the story more than I want to impress them with my artwork. Although ironically, I found out that the very first Marvel film sequence where you see all the images dropping
Oh,
into
yeah,
the logo,
uh-huh,
a bunch of that is from that issue.
yeah, yeah,
Did you know this?
yeah. I noticed when your artwork would show up in there.
I was surprised because I had no idea. Somebody pointed it out to me. I went, "Wow, yeah, that's my
Hey,
guardsman." And oh, hey,
there
yeah, I remember that. So it cracked me up. I'm like, "Woohoo! I'm in the Marvel flop."
you're in the movies. Now, during that run, almost every single team member got a costume change or other
Yes,
major change in their look. Was that
yeah,
something that you requested, or was that something
yeah.
Fabian already had written into the
We,
stories?
we we both talked about it. Fabian and I got to be very good friends working on that run. We still are. And we both discussed it as like it would be fun because that was happening a lot in the other comics at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So like the X-Men, the Avengers, like everybody was getting these new looks. So we thought, well, why not the Warriors? And so it was Fabian's idea to turn Namorita it was his idea to turn her blue. And so he asked me to design, he had ideas for some of the costumes, like, hey, like make it very ocean oriented. So I had fun like putting like I think it was his idea to give her a shell boob. And I like putting the netting on her
Yeah.
waist and stuff like that. I like that design. A lot of people didn't, although I am looking at the action figure and she's blue. And I thought that I had a design for Night Thrasher that ironically was closer to what Blade ended up looking like when he came out in the movies, because this was before then.
Hmm.
And I thought that was a better look for Night Thrasher, but because he had his own comic, they wouldn't let me change him. So he just stayed the way he was. But I always felt like Nova had a lot of people that would draw Nova back in the day, they would draw the helmet and then draw features into the openings of the helmet rather than the other way around. And I always thought
Okay.
that was kind of, and it always looked wonky and stupid as a result. So I thought, no, he's got a head inside there. So like the Rocketeer, you got to think about the head inside. So I redesigned it so you could see his nose, and I just did tweaks on it. And then with Robbie with Speedball, I thought it was funny that he would try to be like more interesting heroes than him. So he would adopt a thing that didn't really work for his power or work for him. So I gave him this big long overcoat
The
that
trench coat look. Yeah.
was intentionally too big, and it would look really stupid when he was like bouncing around because it would get all tangled up around his legs. And I thought that was really funny. And again, like Space Beaver, like nobody really got my joke. But, whatever.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
but
Robbie
that
thought
was
it
funny to me
looked
about.
cool.
But I
So.
was actually, but what I was really proud about with Space or with Speedball is that I did change. I gave him goggles, which they kept, and
Hmm.
because the Ditko design, while it was cool, putting all those little circles around the eyes made the eyes kind of disappear when he had to draw the figure this big. And since he was on a team, he would often be small in a group. So by giving him goggles, it was a way to like let his expressions be more open without losing the flair of what made the character fun. And then I like that big. I like swapping gave him putting balls or circles on his fingertips was the same problem. Like it would disappear on his hands. So I made the gloves black and the stripes on his gloves with
Yeah.
circles. So I just kind of flopped that stuff around from a design standpoint. And I was very happy with my Speedball design, and the jacket was a joke. He didn't wear it for
And
long.
yeah, I'm very happy with it too.
Oh, look at that! That's badass. I know that was the second issue I drew.
Yep. Yep.
And
Absolutely.
I love that issue. I got to draw a demon Speedball, and then Firestar also. I never liked the original Firestar costume from, although I was a big fan of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, because I learned the history of that character, and she was actually
Hmm.
supposed to be Mary Jane. I don't know if you know this,
Yeah.
and that's why she has the red hair and everything. But then they just made up an original character for her because they didn't want Mary Jane. I think it was like running around in a skin tight suit. I don't know what the deal was, but Saturday morning thinking when people that didn't work on comics were making comic book shows. But I always thought her mask looked kind of silly, like this big Mardi Gras mask. And then I also thought her all yellow suit was kind of boring.
Okay.
So while a lot of people, they love the character, I just thought she could be more. And so I thought it would be, again, with her like protecting her eyes made sense to me. If she's flying around, goggles made sense to me so she wouldn't get shit in her eyes. Um, yeah, but I think like that. So like I think about what you would, if you're flying about, what are your problems going to be? So I gave her the jacket so she could have like some imagery, and I loved it when George Perez took it, put it in the Avengers. That was really cool watching George draw my design. And I thought her costume was an upgrade too. I liked the black against the flames because it made me think of like super cool muscle cars and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I thought giving her some black made the flames pop more. So that was Angelica. And yeah, the only one I didn't get to play with was Night Thrasher, but if I had, he looked a lot. My early drawings made him look more like Blade. So he had like these black glasses and a lot of body armor that he would put under a coat.
And Rage was another redesign you
Yeah,
did.
that was actually more Fabe than me. That was one of the few times that Fabe brought me an idea and he had really sketched it all out. So he came up with that base, the big, like he
The
wanted him to look
mask.
like yeah, like he wanted him to look like he is made from like car parts. And like
Okay.
so his face was kind of inspired by a hubcap and then I think I gave him the big chain around the waist. I don't remember, but we worked on a few different designs back and forth, but that was very much Fabe's take, and he had a good. I love that story arc too, where he loses his grandma. I always thought
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
I had a thing I never got to do with Speedball and Rage, but I like that combination a lot.
Yeah. You mentioned that Speedball was definitely one of your favorites, and you actually got to do some of your first writing credits for Marvel in the annuals
Yes,
there. So
yeah,
what attracted you to him as opposed to other members of the team?
I liked him because he's an awkward kid. He like by perfect casting would have been Michael Anthony Hall from 16 Candles.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
at that era, Vacation, 16 Candles, like that to me would be like a perfect speedball. And because it's like, especially like Michael Anthony Hall in Vacation, because he's not being an over the top geek. He's just being himself, and he's a little bit cool. Like he taught when he sees his cousin in Vacation, like he's a little more worldly than him, and he listens to good music. So like I like that version of him as Speedball, but I love the fact that he was like a skinny geek until his powers kicked in, and he had and there was a Peter Parker element I really liked about him. That's actually in that story I wrote. It's like I bet you Spider-Man never had a day like this. Spider-Man had 100 days like that, where
Right.
Flash Thompson was trying to push him around. He couldn't show his powers off. And I like that idea, like we were going back to saying about Superman, where the world was cardboard. Well, Robbie is being pushed into an untenable situation, and if he loses his temper, then he could kill this kid. And he lets him humiliate him. And luckily, he gets the girl anyway. But at the same time, it's like that. I always think about that with Superman. It's like Superman's greatest power is his self control. There's actually a really good scene. I don't like the movie overall, but in Man of Steel, I love that moment where in Man of Steel, where Clark is just working in that bar and the trucker is pushing the girl around, pours a drink on his head, and
Uh-huh.
and you could just see like Superman wants to just rip this guy in two, and then he goes out and his truck is all fucked up, and that's pretty cool, because that's a good Superman moment to me. Is like when and Henry Cavill was a terrific Superman, so like the way he held his dignity, even though this guy was humiliating him, that I like that idea of power is really what you do with it. Like true heroism is not being able to wield your power willy-nilly. It's about how you use your power and who you are inside. Like anybody can put on a Superman costume. It doesn't make them Superman, which is what I like to say when people say, oh, you're just making fun of Superman with the Homelander. I'm like, no, Superman would never do what the Homelander does. And that's very important to distinguish.
Yeah. Now, you got to do some more writing when you went to Malibu Comics and you
Yes,
created or
briefly.
co-created some characters there. I know it didn't
Hmm.
work out great in the end, but do you mind
No.
talking about how you got started working over there?
I was on New Warriors. I had my first apartment, and again, this was like the second bubble that I was a part of. And so, just the same way I got recruited into doing black and white comics, I got recruited into being part of this new company. I'm still very good friends with Hank Canals, and but he had launched the Image guys via Malibu. But
Uh-huh.
when Image broke off and became their own company, Malibu wanted to do something to fill that void that they left. And so they started putting together the Ultraverse, and I got recruited by a writer and invited to come over, and they ended up assigning me a bunch of books. When the book that I co-created, the writer and I had a falling out. and I didn't continue on, they were saying at Malibu, like, hey, we really want you to stay and work with us, even though this book didn't work out with you guys. What would you like to do? And I said, well, I got my own ideas. I could write and draw my own characters. And so I pitched them Ripfire, and they liked it. And it was supposed to be an ongoing story, but story of my life. My career has been a series of showing up at the party right as everybody gets their clothes off and jumps in the pool. The cops come. So that's like soon as I'm skinny dipping with all the cute girls, here come the cops, or the parents come home. That's been my career. So in black and white comics, the bubble exploded just as I got Space Beaver out into the world, and I just looked like Boo Boo the Fool with this black and white comic. But had it been a couple of years earlier, might have been treated in a different reception, because there were a lot of books that weren't much better than Space Beaver doing quite well, because of this riding this wave of this turtle fandom. And so the same thing in the 90s is that, once Image got out and going, I'd been briefly invited to come be a part of that. But I remember thinking, like, well, if these guys aren't meeting deadlines is a problem, I don't see how on their own they're going to do it. And I was correct. A lot of those books suffered because they weren't coming out on time.
Yeah.
And Marvel and DC was still a good place to be at the time. I was making good money and I was working on these. I just got there, I still wanted to draw all my favorite characters. They had done, they had that time. So, and more power to them. I'm really happy Image exists. It just wasn't a good timing for me to, go off as an unknown and, go off on an indie career. But yeah, it was. So with Malibu, though, it was an opportunity for me to kind of like stretch my legs a little bit, because they wanted me to stick around. And so I came up with, I had my own idea for Ripfire and started developing that, but then they gave me the solution to draw while I developed Ripfire, because I could handle multiple books at once at the time, because I had nothing else going on in my life except drawing. And I had my own apartment, and life was pretty good for 23-year-old Darick. But I was just drawing day and night, and but I was happy, and the more work they'd give me, the more I'd do. So I was drawing not postcards, trading cards and posters, and covers for a bunch of stuff. And,
yeah.
It was a very prolific time for me, and while I was doing New Warriors. So but ultimately, about the time they went from Ripfire going to be its own comic to being breaking in 10-page chapters, so it could be a backup in this other comic, to putting out an issue 0 to launch the series, to the company imploding. So, got my book ready to go, and the cops showed up, and I had to get my clothes on quickly and head out the door. So that was that's how that all, and then Marvel bought that, and all those characters got buried. And the worst part was, in the final act of Malibu Comics, they had given me a book called Ultra Force. Hank Canals was the editor. I was teamed up with Warren Ellis for the first time,
Right.
and which was great, and because I could tell he was super talented. But also, after Ultra Force, they put Ripfire in the book, and they killed him. And the worst part was, the only thing I had said to Malibu going in with my character is, like, the only thing that's really important to me about this is that this is a character that would never join a team, because he's an alien. He wouldn't know how to relate. So he's more like a Daredevil kind of a character, where, like, he doesn't become part of the Avengers. He's always off doing his own thing.
Okay.
They can interact, but he would never be part of the team.
Right.
So of course they put him on the team, and then they killed him, and they didn't even let me draw his death. So that was like, and the way they wrote him was terrible as far as I was concerned, because they didn't understand what made the character tick in the slightest. And it was clearly the person who was on, it just felt like the person who was on the job, like, knew that the shop was closing, and this was just, let's just get it done and get it out the door.
Yeah.
Because there was, his death was very unceremonious.
Now, you got to do more writing at Malibu. You'd done a little bit at Marvel, and obviously Space Beaver before that. It's not something you do very often, although I personally enjoy when you do.
Thanks.
Is that something you want to do more of? And how does writing differ from art in terms of how you feel when you're doing it?
I love writing, and how I always have. It's just that I've been humbly and blessed. I've been really fortunate, and I like to joke that all these writers I've worked with, they worked with me. But when you have really great writers that want to collaborate with you, it feels stupid to write your own stuff. Like, why would I turn away somebody who is great at what they do that can't draw, when I think I'm an okay writer, but I'm not on the level of some of the guys I've worked with. And I think I'm getting better, but it's a skill like anything else.
Mhm.
And so, I can tell a good story. I know what makes a good story work. But at the same time, like, I love the act of collaboration. If I could be part of telling the story, like, in every creator-owned book I've ever worked on, I'm in there. I'm in there coming up with ideas. I'm in there saying, "Hey, what about this? How about that?" And like, so it's not just me being told what to draw and then drawing it. I bring my writing skills to a collaboration, because a lot of the people I work with can't draw, but I can write a little. So that's where I'm kind of I'm a twofer, like you get my right. I'm also a good collaborator, in that I'll listen and I'll dig down into the ideas and go, "Hey, did you think about that? Or what about this?" And like I was explaining why Firestar has goggles, you should try to keep shit out of her eyes,
Right.
not just because it looks good, not only because it looks good, but it's also proactive. It protects her,
Yeah.
like there's a
And
reason.
it
And I
still had a little bit of the homage to the original
right.
mask with the pointed ends and
But like the original mouse never made sense to me, because it was so big it would just fly off,
yeah.
or when she was flying around. Also, why didn't it catch fire? But anyway, to me, like, the goggles could be heat sensitive. But I digress. But I like writing, and I got to write and draw Conan the Barbarian. I wrote and drew Batman a couple years ago.
Yeah.
I wrote and drew Spider-Man a little bit, for some backup stories in some super specials. So at some point or another, I've actually got to work on some major characters, and it always did well. It got published. It didn't, I didn't. It's kind of hard to change the trajectory of something or reinvent the wheel when you're just doing a standalone story. But if it's enjoyable and people buy it, then I figured, okay, great. I mean, the fact that I got to relaunch Legends of the Dark Knight #1 with my art and story was like, man, like, next to Wolverine #1, I got a Batman #1. So felt pretty good. So I love writing, and I still do. I wrote a book called Greaser that, unfortunately, again, my career, we didn't do too great out the gate, because the artist was not prepared for the monthly schedule, and it's not dead, but it's in hiatus. But I'm writing that, and I'm building a world. And it's the first time I've actually worked with somebody that I'm not drawing the book. I've designed some of the characters, but I was going to write and draw this. But I decided to work with somebody with a very different style than me, in order to sort of show, in a way, showcase the writing that I'm doing. But it got good reviews. People liked it. It's called Greaser. It's issue 1's available, but issue 2's still in the works.
I'll have to search that out. I hadn't seen that one.
You and most of the world.
Which company is that from?
Magma.
Okay.
My last San Diego Comic-Con, as we were discussing, was promoting Greaser.
Got it.
But it's an original idea, and I like it. I hope that I get to do more. But but I always have, I have like a folder with like 15 different springboards in them, or 4 or 5, half-written scripts, or like, I do this all the time. If I get an idea, I'll write it down, or if it catches hold like Space Beaver did, I'll just keep going on it. But I have some very, very talented people that I would be thrilled to be collaborating with, that want to work with me. Why would I say no to that? If I run out of those projects, that's when I'll write and draw.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. Now, kind of going through your things a little more chronologically, speaking of people you've collaborated with, you mentioned Warren Ellis. started with him at Malibu. How did that collaboration evolve?
We got teamed up on Ultraforce, but when I was reading those scripts, I was so genuinely impressed with how well written they were, because he would throw these little details in that the audience would never read, but the artist, me, would read.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved it because it made me really see his scenes or his characters the way he was taking dog characters at the time and giving them real depth and making them interesting. I remember specifically there was a scene he wrote where like Black Knight and I don't know, Ghoul, I think that was his name, and like the dead looking dude who was fun to draw actually. And but they're all, the Ultraverse are all in this meeting room having a conversation about this case they're on. And he wrote into the script, it's like they're drinking black coffee and eating bacon sandwiches. Now, that was nothing that was really going to translate in the art to the audience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe I have them eating a sandwich, maybe they're drinking out of a cup, but you don't know what's in the cup and you don't know what's on the sandwich. It wasn't important. It was just an interesting detail. But what I loved about it is that he put it in there for the artist, because I wasn't assigned yet when he wrote it, but he put it in there for the artist to understand. And for me, I suddenly could smell that room. I felt like I was in that room with them. I could smell the bacon on the sandwiches. I could smell the fresh pot of coffee. I could imagine this was a room people were working in. And that really took me out of the superhero world and really put me into the world of these people doing a job. And that was an incredible good shift for my head, because a lot of times, especially in the 90s, where I was being pushed at, at Marvel and everything was that extreme, like
Right,
everybody
yeah.
had to be doing extreme, like, have some water, it was never, I'm answering the phone. It was never subtle. It was always like, and people were getting away with just drawing like splash figures and things like that rather than telling a story. And I was trying to walk that line where John Romita Jr. had given me some great advice where it's like, this is how I do it. And he'd do splashy figures, but he said, but you always want to pay attention to the storytelling. And I'm like, I get it. Thank you. Find your moments to make the splash panels, but make them count because they're telling the story. And I said, thank you. So a quiet scene in a comic like that at the time was kind of refreshing. And I like drawing quiet scenes. And so rather than having them all stand around dramatically in costume, looking like superheroes, I just had them hanging out, eating sandwiches and looking at computers and talking to one another.
Right.
And I think that really made a difference for how I would interpret characters going forward, and why my later assignments would involve characters that I could bring a human edge to.
Yeah.
I like that too about New Warriors. Like Fabian was great about writing moments like that as well.
Oh yeah, the issue with Nova and Nita kissing on the cover, where there's I don't think there's a single fight page in it where it's just Robbie talking to his dad. And
yeah, that was a good issue. I like that. I remember that's one of the reasons I loved Robbie so much too. I had fun. Like, I love when his dad says, well, I don't want you to fall and hurt yourself. And he kind of looks at him like, are you kidding? And
if
that
I
was
fall, I
just a
think I'll
silent
bounce
beat,
back.
yeah, I'm going to be all right. It's like, but it was a good, because that's what a father would say. And at the same time, like, I love, I was able to convey the absurdity of it with just the look on Robbie's face. He didn't have to say anything, but I was able to convey it with his expression. And I like that kind of stuff. That's the essence of good comics for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And Transmetropolitan, you worked on that for the entire run.
Yeah, we co-created.
Yeah. And while New Warriors touched on some political stuff, I think Transmet was the first book you were involved in that was actively political in its...
Yeah, a little, just a little.
And you yourself are very active on Blue Sky talking about politics.
I have to just vent. Like, there's a part of me that is Spider Jerusalem, and he's the me I wish I could be. Like, I'd rather be Spider than Batman. It's like, I loved Spider, and I was a punk rock teenager And I love, that's kind of where my righteous indignation came from, was like, the punk rock was always talking about the injustices of the world, and and about fighting back and fuck you to authority and all that. So I kind of brought that element. So when Warren and I had worked on Ultra Force, I had reached out to him and said, hey, look, I love this script. I told him what I just told you. And I said, I think you're brilliant. You're going to be huge. And he was very self-deprecating and cynical about his own career at the time. So he's like, yeah, right. And I'm like, no, I really think you're going to be a luminary talent. And I said, if you ever want to do a monthly book together, I'm your Huckleberry. I didn't say that, but you get the joke. So, but then another book came up. Fabian went off to be editor-in-chief at what was Valiant and had become Acclaim for a brief time. And they had they had Solar. And so Warren had written a sci-fi book called Man of the Atom. And Fabian knew me and had worked with me extensively. And we were still friends. And so I don't know if Warren suggested it or they both collaborated together and said, we should get Darick for this book. But what Warren would tell me later is it was something of a trial for me to see what I would do without superheroes, because I was only known for them at the time.
Right.
And ironically, I was trying to get into Vertigo and work with Neil Gaiman and Sandman, and Karen was like, but you draw superheroes. Like, she couldn't imagine. So that would come back and bite me in the ass too. So I did Solar Man of the Atom, and Warren was really impressed with how I handled just quiet sci-fi moments. And because there was a lot of people conversing, and it was kind of a weird story about this priest with this hidden library, and I had a lot of fun drawing it. And I like making quiet scenes visually interesting. If I can pull it off, I'm proud of that.
Yeah.
And so when he had seen that, he thought, well, this whole new line of comics called Helix was going to launch as a sister company to the fantasy that was Vertigo. They wanted to do Helix as a sci-fi line. And they had a really great lineup of talent. And Transmetropolitan was one of those books, and Warren asked if I wanted to, work on it with him. And his original vision was it was going to be like I do 3 issues, and then they'd bring on another artist, kind of like 2020 Visions was at the time.
Right.
But I loved the idea so much that I said, oh my God, I want to do this book monthly. And then he said, well, hey, if you want to do it monthly, I'll make you co-creator. Let's do this together. And Transmetropolitan was born. So a lot of those original ideas came with the first drawing I did of Spider Jerusalem. And very unusually, like, he was almost fully formed right out of the chute. My very, very first drawing of him looks very much like the Spider Jerusalem that we refined him a little, and there were some things I didn't know that Warren wanted, like that he burns his hair off in a shower accident. So right. I thought he was just a guy, and I thought he would be homeless for some reason, because I thought he would always be on the run from the authorities. So I kind of designed him to be sort of this like guy that was running down alleys and hiding in hidey holes, and I put duct tape on his boots, and I pictured that he would just shave his head so he wouldn't have to deal with his hair. But he's like, no, and he would have stubble and a stubbly head. And Warren's like, oh no, it's all burned off clean. And so we had this back and forth, but and his original name was Caleb Newcastle. And then Stuart Moore, the editor, was like, it's too British. Let's give him a more. And so I will always regret that I don't have this list of 5 names somewhere. But Spider Jerusalem was one of 5 alternate names, and we all agreed we liked that one.
Okay.
But that's how Spider was born and Transmetropolitan was born. But I love the concept. It was a very, he kind of just gave me a verbal pitch, but it just exploded my mind with what we could do. And when it came to designing the city. So when I designed this original piece, I drew this mutant cat because I thought, okay, in the future, cats and dogs will probably be eaten out of dumpsters, and they probably have lost control of, animal control. And as a result, who knows what's in those toxic dumpsters of the future. So the cats just start mutating, and that's where the 3-eyed cat was born. And Warren's like, what's that? And I told him that. And he's like, oh, that's cool. Let's make it his pet. And I'm like, that's a great idea. So we would like throw the creative ball back and forth. And and make that world.
Mm-hmm.
And what I loved most about it is it wasn't anything goes world. So I really just kind of like free flowed through those issues. I would make sure Warren's story and the point of the stories was front and center, but when it came to the backgrounds, like unless it was essential for what he needed or some funny gag that he put in there, like he asked me to draw a security guard to look like a big Charlie Brown. That was hilarious. But when when Spider kicks him out the window and he squashes the puppy, I made the puppy look like Snoopy, and that was me. So, but that's how we would collaborate, and I loved it. And that's why I stuck with the issues. And I wanted to pencil and ink and do the whole run, and just the way Warren wrote was just not feasible for that, because I would get scripts like 2 weeks before they were due at the printer, and I'd have to like draw those issues like overnight sometimes, where I'd 4 or 5 pages a day, and every major life change happened in my life in those 5 years. Starting with the death of my parents, to moving to Italy, to moving back, getting married, moved to New York, having my first kid, and wrapping up the series in New York City, from starting in San Francisco. So it was a very crazy 5 years, but it was kind of perfect for where my brain needed to be at the time.
I decided to cut off things there as we move into another big project that Darick worked on. You'll be able to hear all of that next week. I'd like to thank Darick again for his time. A quick reminder that the, mostly, uncut version of our discussion is available on Patreon, where you can also get unedited audio of other conversations I've had, as well as scripts for all the written episodes. It's just $1 per month to join at patreon.com/welcome to Geektown. If you want a free way to help the show out, leaving a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts or other podcast site is always appreciated. But no matter what, as long as you continue to listen, we'll always say,
welcome to Geektown. Population, us.
Questions for the Welcome to Geektown interviews are written by me, Kurt Onstead. I also host, edit, and produce the podcast. Theme song was written by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana.